The marble floors of Voss Holdings breathed cold long before any human foot crossed them at night, the kind of institutional cold that seeped up through rubber-soled shoes and settled in the ankles, in the knees, in the particular hollow behind the sternum where a person stores their tiredness. Lyra Okafor knew that cold the way she knew the smell of industrial citrus cleaner and the precise angle at which a mop head shed water without leaving streaks. She had been crossing these floors for 11 months, arriving at 10 in the evening when the suits departed in their black cars, and leaving before 6 in the morning when the first assistant arrived to brew the coffee nobody thanked her for making possible by scrubbing the machine's milk-foamed nozzle each night until it gleamed. She was invisible by design. She had spent a long time perfecting it. The shapeless gray uniform she wore was 2 sizes larger than her body required, even though her body required a size that most people clocked immediately and then looked away from, eyes sliding past her, the way water slides past stone. She had learned to move in the margins of rooms, to press herself against walls when executives walked the corridors after late meetings, to keep her gaze trained on the floor as if searching it for something she had dropped. She had not dropped anything. She was a certified forensic accountant who could read a balance sheet the way some people read weather in the sky, and she cleaned corporate offices at night because the day had not offered her anything else after the firm that promised her a future decided her body was an inconvenience in a glass-fronted lobby. So here she was, in the 42nd floor suite of Voss Holdings at 11:53 on a Thursday in November, working her way methodically from the east wall toward the west with her cart, when she heard the elevator open behind her. Nobody took that elevator after 11. She knew the building's rhythms like a second skeleton worn beneath her skin. She did not turn around immediately. When she finally did, holding her spray bottle at her side like something she had forgotten was there, the man who stepped from the elevator was wearing black, all of it, and the temperature of the room dropped. Darius Voss did not look at the cleaner standing beside the conference table. He rarely looked at anything in his buildings that was not a problem requiring immediate resolution. He walked to the head of the table, set down a black leather folio, and opened it without sitting, reading standing up the way a man reads who considers chairs a form of delay. He had been in 3 meetings already since 6 that morning, one of which had involved a decision he was still digesting, and his jaw held a tension that his tailor would have recognized as the particular set that preceded someone losing their employment. Lyra Okafor began spraying the glass tabletop in wide, even arcs, moving her cloth in the smooth, overlapping circles she had perfected, keeping herself below his sight line in the way she always kept herself below everybody's sight line. She had become so good at this that she occasionally startled people who had been in a room with her for 10 minutes. She was large, genuinely large, with the kind of build that filled a door frame when she turned sideways, broad, soft shoulders and a waist that curved and widened into hips that her oversized uniform covered with determined shapelessness, thighs that pressed together when she walked and curved away from each other when she stood, a heaviness to her that was actual and real, and which she had spent 28 years learning to apologize for with the architecture of her clothing and the compression of her movements. She made herself small in ways that had nothing to do with her actual size. Darius Voss turned a page. She moved the cloth. 17 minutes passed in this arrangement. The quiet between them, the administrative silence of a space occupied by 2 people who exist in entirely separate social registers. Then she reached the end of the table, the far corner near the window where the building's view spread out like something an architect had hung there deliberately to remind people of their altitude, and her cartwheel caught the lip of the low credenza behind her. She felt the shift before it happened, that awful suspended moment when the physics of an object in motion become undeniable, and she lurched to catch the spray bottle that had begun to slide, and in catching it, she knocked the credenza's decorative object, a heavy glass award with a sharp crystalline base, and it struck the marble floor with a sound that was enormous in the silence, a shattering that sent pieces skittering across the floor in 3 directions. She stood perfectly still with the spray bottle pressed to her chest, breathing. The room recalibrated around the echo of the breaking. Darius Voss looked up from his folio. His eyes were the color of deep water in a harbor, dark slate with something moving at the bottom of them that she could not read from this distance, and they found her with an efficiency that suggested he had already triangulated the source of the sound before he raised his head. Lyra said nothing. She crouched immediately, gathering the largest pieces of glass with her gloved hands, reaching under the credenza for the fragments that had scattered there, working with the quiet, practiced efficiency of someone who has cleaned up other people's messes her entire adult life, in more registers than the literal. Her hands were steady, her face was not. She could feel the heat of it, the awful radiating flush that climbed her throat and settled in her cheeks and the back of her neck, the involuntary physical autobiography of shame. She did not look at him. She heard him close the folio. She heard his footsteps cross the floor toward her and stop approximately 2 feet from where she crouched, and she was aware of the sheer physical fact of him, the way you are aware of a weather system that has moved into the room, the low atmospheric pressure of a person who commands rather than requests. She carefully wrapped the largest shard in a section of her cleaning cloth. Her fingers were precise and practiced. She heard him say, with no inflection whatsoever, the single word, "stand." She stood, because she was not foolish enough to do otherwise, and found herself looking at the second button of his black shirt, and had to tip her head back to meet his eyes, which were already on her face with an attention that felt nothing like the way other eyes had been on her face in professional contexts. Those eyes had always performed a small glancing calculation, a rapid inventory of her dimensions that concluded in a decision to look slightly past her. These eyes were still. They were on her face, and they stayed there. He said, "What's your name?" Not a question, a data request. She said, "Lyra Okafor." Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. "Night cleaning. I'll replace the award, obviously. I'll speak to the supervisor and arrange for the cost to come out of my wages." He looked at her with an expression she could not classify. His face was angular in a way that was almost architectural, a jaw that looked like it had been resolved rather than grown, dark brows with the kind of horizontal discipline that went with a person who did not allow themselves theatrical reactions. He said, "That award was a gift from an associate I no longer respect. It is not a loss." She blinked. He said, "Are your hands cut?" She looked down at her gloves. There was no blood. "No." "Good." He returned to his folio and opened it as if the conversation had been a brief administrative note that had been filed. She stared at the side of his face for a moment, with the particular confusion of someone who has braced for an impact that did not arrive, then turned back to her cart, finished gathering the fragments, and completed her route with the systematic quiet she had maintained for 11 months. When she reached the elevator, she heard him say without looking up, "The mop head needs replacing on cart 3. She stopped. She turned. She said, "I know. I submitted the requisition 2 weeks ago." He turned 1 page. "It will be approved tomorrow." The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. She stood inside the descent for 12 floors before she remembered to breathe correctly. The requisition was approved. She found the confirmation in the building services email at 6:15 the next morning, sitting on the night bus with her coat buttoned to the throat and her bag on her lap, and she stared at the screen for long enough that the man beside her shifted in his seat. It was not the approval that made her stare. It was the approval timestamp. 2:57 in the morning. He had still been in the building. He had gone into the facilities management system at 2:57 in the morning and approved a mophead requisition for a cleaning cart. She thought about this with the portion of her brain that was trained to notice anomalies, the part that had once found a discrepancy in a 17-column spreadsheet that 7 senior accountants had cleared. She filed it. She went home. She slept for 4 hours. She returned to Voss Holdings that evening at 10, and the building breathed its cold at her as it always had, and she began her route at the east wall and worked toward the west, and the 42nd floor was empty and dark and smelled faintly of the particular cedar and black pepper cologne that had been in the air the previous night, and she stood in that smell for one unguarded moment before she snapped herself back to her spray bottle and her cloth. The weeks that followed arranged themselves into a pattern she did not examine too closely. Darius Voss was in the building late 3 or 4 times each week. He did not always come to the 42nd floor. When he did, he acknowledged her with a single word or not at all, and she accommodated his presence with the professional displacement she had practiced since her first night. And they existed in the same rooms the way 2 separate weather systems exist in the same sky, each with its own pressure and direction. Except that she began to notice things. She noticed that the stack of financial reports on the conference table changed each week, that the same consultant firm's name appeared on the covers in rotation, that the figures she inadvertently absorbed while cleaning around the documents had a pattern of rounding that was imprecise in a specific and suspicious way. She noticed this the way she noticed the mop head. She filed it. She said nothing. She was a night cleaner. She cleaned. The Tuesday in December that everything changed arrived without ceremony, preceded only by an ice storm that had glazed the city sidewalks in a film of transparent danger and driven the temperature into a range that made the walk from the subway an act of committed endurance. Lyra had wrapped her scarf twice and still felt the cold in her back teeth by the time she reached the building's service entrance. She signed in. She took her cart. She rode the service elevator to 42. She rounded the corner from the elevator into the suite and stopped. There was a woman standing at the reception desk outside the conference room, and the woman was not someone Lyra recognized from the building's regular population of assistants and coordinators. She was a particular kind of thin that announced itself as a decision. Blonde hair that had been arranged rather than styled, wearing a winter coat that retail therapy had purchased rather than need, and she was looking at Lyra with the expression of someone who has just noticed an object that has been misplaced in their visual field. Lyra pulled her cart past the desk with her eyes forward, the practiced non-engagement of 11 months of invisibility. She heard the woman say, to no one in particular since there was no one else present, "They really do send anyone up here, don't they?" Lyra kept moving. The woman said, louder, addressing her now directly, "Excuse me, I asked you a question." Lyra stopped. She turned. She looked at the woman with a patience that she had built out of many years of absorbing this particular variety of performance. She said, "You didn't ask a question. You made a statement." The woman's expression refined itself into something sharper. "Don't be smart. I'm afraid that's not something I can help." She turned back to her cart. She heard the woman make a sound of incredulity, and then heard the door behind her open, and the air pressure of the room shifted the way it had that first night on the 42nd floor, and without turning around she knew. The cedar and black pepper arrived a half-second before his voice did. Darius said, "Celeste," one word, the woman said, with the warmth of someone who has pre-planned warmth. "Darius, finally. I've been waiting," he said. "I see that." He walked past the reception desk into the conference room and held the door open in the universal physical grammar of an expectation. Celeste gathered herself and walked toward the door, and as she passed Lyra, she said, in a voice calibrated to carry precisely as far as Lyra's ears, "How do people this size even manage physical labor?" The door did not close. Lyra had her back turned and her cloth on the glass. She heard the absolute silence from inside the room that follows a sentence landing in a space where it was not expected to be audible. She moved her cloth in circles. She had 17 years of practice with this particular kind of silence. Then she heard Darius Voss say, still in that conversational baritone that never required elevation, "Repeat that," Celeste said, with the stammer of someone who has miscalculated a distance. "I was only—" "Repeat it," he said, "so that I understand precisely what you said, and so that you understand that I heard it." The silence that followed was the kind that precedes a structural change. Lyra had gone very still. "I don't think," Celeste began. "No," Darius said. "You didn't." There was a pause. "This meeting is finished. My associate will show you out." Lyra heard footsteps she did not recognize arrive from somewhere she could not place, and then Celeste's voice, recalibrated now into something conciliatory and slightly afraid, and then the sound of the elevator opening and closing, and the suite returning to its nighttime register of climate control and marble cold. She did not turn around. She was breathing with great care and attention, the way you breathe when your body has not yet decided whether it is angry or devastated and is holding the question open. She heard him cross the room. He stopped behind her, at a distance of perhaps 3 feet, and stood there. She said, to the glass of the table, "You didn't need to do that." He said, "I know." She waited. He said, "Turn around, Lyra." She turned around. He was looking at her with that dark harbor stillness, and his hands were at his sides, and there was something in the set of his jaw that she had not seen there before, a resolution that had arrived from a different direction than his usual ones. He said, "How long has this been happening to you?" She looked at him. She said, "How long has what been happening?" He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "All of it." She had no answer for that. That fit inside normal professional language, so she said nothing. And he accepted her silence, the way he accepted most things, without requiring it to be different than it was. She found the discrepancy 3 days later, not by looking for it, but because she had been breathing near the documents for weeks, and her brain was the kind of brain that didn't stop processing just because she had told it to. She was cleaning the glass tabletop on a Thursday evening when the specific number surfaced in her mind with the inevitability of a word you've been trying to remember, fully formed and precise. She stood with her cloth in her hand and did the calculation she had been unconsciously assembling for 6 weeks, and the calculation resolved into a figure that made her cloth go still against the table. The consulting firm, whose name rotated across the report covers, had been billing Voss Holdings at a rate that appeared legitimate until you cross-referenced the service hours against the deliverables filed, a discrepancy hidden in the rounding of a decimal place across 16 separate invoices, which individually read as administrative error and collectively read as $147,000 in fraudulent billing over 18 months. She stood there for a full minute, holding the cloth. She was a night cleaner. She was a certified forensic accountant. She was holding knowledge she had no professional standing to act on, and every professional training to recognize. She finished cleaning the table. She went home. She sat at the small desk in her apartment that held her laptop and her 2 external hard drives and her stack of accounting textbooks that she kept, because letting them go felt like surrendering something she couldn't afford to surrender. And she spent 4 hours building a documentation file that organized the discrepancy into a format that would be irrefutable to anyone who read it with competent eyes. She did not know what she was going to do with it. She knew she was going to do something with it. She was back in the building the next evening at 10, and Darius Voss was already in the suite when she arrived, which was unusual for a Friday, and he was standing at the windows looking at the city, with his hands clasped behind his back and his black jacket aligned with a precision that suggested someone had taught him very early that the exterior projected authority the interior might not always feel. She pulled her cart to the table. She took out the folded document she had printed at the library on her lunch break. She said, "I need to tell you something that you're going to think is strange." He turned from the window. He looked at her. He said, "Tell me." She unfolded the paper. She walked to the table and spread it flat and said, "I know I'm the night cleaner. I understand how this is going to sound, but I'm also a certified forensic accountant, and I've been inadvertently looking at your reports for 6 weeks, and there's a systematic billing fraud being run by your consulting firm. I've documented it. She stepped back from the table. She folded her hands in front of her. She said, Meridian Consulting, $147,000 over 18 months. It's in the decimal, rounding on the service hours. Your internal team would have caught it if they'd cross-referenced deliverables against billing, but they're only looking at the invoice totals. The silence was different from the usual kind. It was not empty. It was full of something being recalibrated at high speed. He crossed to the table. He read. She watched him read, which was itself a kind of exposure she was not accustomed to, watching someone move through her work while she stood present for it. His face gave nothing away. His jaw did the thing she had catalogued by now as deep processing, a slight hardness along the left side that meant the information was integrating. He looked up. He said, How did you find this? She said, The same way I find everything. I was in the room. He looked at her for a long moment that she felt in her sternum. He said, Your name, your full name, Lyra Okafor, your certifications, CPA, CFE. I did my graduate work in forensic accounting at Alderman University. I've been working nights since I left the firm. She watched something move through his face that she couldn't fully read, but which felt like the aftermath of an enormous structural recognition. He said, Which firm? She told him. He said, Why did you leave? She looked at him and decided to tell the truth because she was tired and because the room was cold and because she had built the documentation file and laid it on the table and there wasn't much left to protect. She said, They decided I didn't represent the company's image correctly in the client-facing lobby. The silence after that was one of the stillest she had ever occupied. He said, The document, is this your only copy? No. Good. He picked up his phone. He said, Intuit, find Marcus. Tell him I need him now. He set the phone down. He looked at her again, and this time the looking had a quality of deliberate inventory that was different from the professional calculation she had expected, moving from her face to her hands still holding the spray bottle and back to her face, as if he were locating something he had misplaced, rather than encountering something new. He said, Lyra, yes, you've been in this building for how long? 11 months? 11 months, he said, and something in how he said it landed in the room with a weight she didn't yet have vocabulary for. Marcus arrived in 9 minutes, which told her something about the geography of his usual locations. A broad man with the kind of stillness that was a different species than Darius's stillness, more deliberate, more physical, the stillness of someone managing potential energy rather than someone who had transcended the need for it. He looked at the document, he looked at Lyra, he looked at Darius. He said nothing. Darius said, The Meridian Principles. I want them located tonight. Nothing moves until I know where they are. Marcus said, And the contact at our end. Darius said, Who approved the contracts? Marcus named a name. Darius said, Pull his access. Tonight. He paused. He'll try to reach the Meridian partners. Don't let that happen. Marcus looked at Lyra again, with a look that was professional, rather than hostile, the look of a person categorizing a new variable. He said, The room was quieter without him. Lyra was still standing beside her cart with her cloth in her hand, and she realized she had been holding it for the entire conversation, with a grip that had left an impression in her palm. She set the cloth on the cart. She said, I should finish the route. Darius said, Sit down. She said, I'm sorry. He said, Sit down, Lyra. She sat at the conference table, at the seat furthest from the head, the natural gravitational position of someone accustomed to the periphery. And he sat not at the head, but at the seat adjacent to hers, which put his left arm approximately 18 inches from her right arm, and his profile into her direct sight line. He said, Tell me what you found. Start from the beginning. All of it. So she told him. She talked for 40 minutes with the document between them and his eyes on her face for most of it. and she felt the profound disorientation of being fully listened to by someone whose attention was a physical presence in the room. She had been trained to present data. She had not been trained for data presentation that felt like being seen. She got through all of it with her voice steady and her hands still on the table, and her face doing the thing it sometimes did when she was deep in material she genuinely understood, becoming something more open than her resting expression, something she would have closed off if she had been watching herself in a mirror. She finished. She said, "That's everything," he said. "You built this documentation in one night, 4 hours, because you calculated it in your head while you were cleaning a table. I'd been accumulating the inputs for 6 weeks." He was quiet. Then he said, "Why did you bring it to me? You could have filed an anonymous report. You have no obligation to this company." She looked at the table. She said, "Because it was wrong. And I was the one who saw it," he said, with a quietness that she felt in the base of her throat. "Yes, you were." His hand moved on the table, not toward her, just moved, a slight shift of his fingers against the surface, a physical readjustment that might have been nothing, and that she noticed with a precision that surprised her. She looked at the table. She said, "I should go," he said, "in a moment." She stayed. The Meridian partners were located. She learned this not from Darius but from Marcus, who appeared at her cart the following Monday evening with the economy of a man who delivers information rather than performs it, and told her that the company's legal team was handling the matter and that her documentation had been certified by 3 independent forensic accountants, and that she should not be concerned about any professional exposure. She said, "I'm not concerned about exposure." He looked at her. He said, "No, I didn't think you were." He left. She cleaned. Darius appeared at 11:30 and crossed the suite without breaking stride, and said, as he passed her, "My office. When you're finished with this room." She finished the room. She went to his office, which was a different space from the conference suite, a room that had been designed with the cold beauty of something purely functional, and which smelled more concentrated of cedar and black pepper. And he was behind the desk with his jacket off for the first time she had seen, and his shirt sleeves pushed to the elbows, and she registered the forearms with an involuntary attention she immediately redirected toward a neutral corner of the room. He said, "Sit down." She sat. He said, "I'd like to offer you a position." She said, "As what?" "Director of Financial Integrity for Voss Holdings. It's not a position that has existed until this conversation." She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "I'm a night cleaner." He said, "You were a night cleaner. Because someone decided your value was determined by the square footage of a lobby." He let that sit. "I'm making a different determination." She felt something move in her chest that she had been keeping tightly managed for a very long time. She said, "I don't exactly present the image that—" He said, "Stop." She stopped. He stood from the desk and walked around it and crouched to her eye level, bringing his face level with hers in a deliberate physical adjustment that rearranged the geometry of the room. And he looked at her from that position, with those dark harbor eyes, and said, in a voice that had dropped below its usual register, into something rough and certain, "You walked into this building, and you were the only person in it who was actually paying attention. You built an airtight fraud case in 4 hours, in the middle of the night, in your personal time, with no standing, and no obligation, and no prospect of recognition. And for 11 months you cleaned floors that you were overqualified to clean, and you never once asked anyone to see you." He paused. "I see you, Lyra." She was not going to do anything embarrassing. She was absolutely not. She said, with a voice that was slightly less steady than her documentation voice, "That's a very compelling performance review," he said, without smiling, but with something in the corners of his eyes that was the structural equivalent of a smile. "I've been told I'm direct." He stood. He returned to his desk. He said, "The position comes with an office on this floor. You'll have full access to every account. I want a complete audit of the last 3 years." She said, That's a significant scope. You'll manage it, she said. I'll need a team. You'll have one, she said. And I'll need the access codes for the legacy financial archives, which your current team has been keeping in a format that's going to make the audit significantly harder than it needs to be, he said. Done, she said. All right, he said. All right, she stood. She picked up her cleaning cloth from where she had set it on the edge of the desk and held it for a moment, and then set it back down and did not pick it up again. He watched this. He said nothing. She walked to the door. His voice came from behind her, still even, still at that low register. Lyra. She turned. He said, "The gray uniform. You won't be wearing it again after tonight." She looked at him. She said, "I don't have a particular wardrobe for," he said. "You will." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I'm not a small woman," he said. "I know exactly what you are." The air in the room did something she did not have technical language for. She said, "Good night, Darius." He said, "Good night." She walked out of the office and into the marble-cold corridor and stood in the elevator for all 14 floors of the descent. And this time she did not forget to breathe, but the breathing was not the same kind as before. It was the kind that happens when something large and long compressed has been given permission to exist, and she stood in the quiet descent with her hand flat against the elevator wall and let it. She wore the first of the clothes that arrived on her chair on Wednesday morning, because she was already in the building by then, because an office on the 42nd floor had manifested over 2 days with an efficiency that spoke the language of Darius Voss's particular variety of authority, and because a car had arrived at her apartment building at 8 in the morning, driven by a man who handed her a garment bag without explanation. She had stood in her narrow hallway holding the bag and had made herself open it, which required overcoming 17 years of conditioning that said clothing was either a source of evidence against you or a mechanism of concealment. Inside was a dress the color of midnight burgundy, structured at the waist in a way that was designed for rather than against the body that would wear it, with fabric that had been cut by someone who understood that softness and fullness were architectural facts to build with, rather than problems to hide. She put it on in the bathroom with the light on, and stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself with the particular quality of attention she usually reserved for spreadsheets, finding the data in the reflection rather than the verdict. She looked. She adjusted the fabric at the shoulder. She looked again. She was a large woman. She was a large woman in a burgundy dress that had been made to celebrate exactly that. She picked up her bag and went to work. Darius was in the corridor when she emerged from the elevator, speaking in a low voice to Marcus, and he turned as she approached and looked at her, with an attention that was not professional in the way his previous attentions had been professional, and was not rude in the way most attention felt, but was instead the deliberate and specific focus of someone who has been waiting for a particular sight and is now acknowledging that it has arrived. He said nothing. Marcus said nothing. She walked to her office, which had her name on the door in the cold sans serif font that the building used for all its signage, and she went in and sat at the desk and opened the Legacy Financial Archive on her screen and began. The audit took 6 weeks. She found 2 additional discrepancies in the first week that had nothing to do with Meridian, historical irregularities that preceded the consulting firm arrangement by 4 years, and which, when traced, pointed to a pattern she brought to Darius on a Friday afternoon, with her documentation organized the way she organized all her documentation, irrefutably. He read it. He sat very still. He said, "How far back does it go?" She said, 7 years, and it's internal. He looked at her. She held his look. He said, "Who?" She told him. His jaw did the thing she had catalogued. He said, with the dangerous conversational calm of a man who has just decided something final, "Show me the transfer trail." She showed him. He sat with it for 20 minutes while she worked from the chair across from him, and she was aware of the room around them as a kind of contained climate, the cedar and black pepper and the low sound of the city below, and the quality of the late afternoon light coming through the windows, and the absolute stillness of him assembling a resolution. He said finally, "You understand what this means." She said, "I understand what this means." He said, "It puts you in a position that could be uncomfortable if anyone decides your findings are inconvenient." She said, "I've been in uncomfortable positions. I've cleaned this building for 11 months. I'm still here." He looked at her, and something in his expression crossed the line between professional and personal with a finality that suggested it would not be recrossing in the other direction. He said, quietly, "Yes, you are." He stood from the desk and walked around it and stood near her, not behind her, beside her, close enough that she could feel the temperature differential of another body in the cold office air. And he looked at the documentation on her screen and said, "I need you to understand something." She waited. He said, "You are not invisible in this building anymore." She said, "I know." He said, "And you are not the night cleaner." She said, "I know that too." He said, his voice dropping to the rough quiet that she had first heard when he crouched to her eye level in this very office. "And you are not leaving." She turned her head and looked at him from where she sat, and found his face at a proximity that the previous 11 months had not prepared her for, and said, "Leaving was not part of my plan." He said, "Good, because you are mine to protect now. That is not a request." She felt the sentence settle into her the way a key settles into a lock, with a precision that suggested it was made for exactly this opening. She said, "I'm also going to need the salary that was listed in the director position documentation, because I looked it up and it's 15% below market rate for the scope of work you've assigned." He said, with the structural equivalent of a smile again. "Done," she said. "And benefits from day one, not after the standard 30-day probationary window." He said. "Done," she said. "And a second monitor." He said. "Lyra." She said, "Yes." He said, "You could have simply said yes." She said, "To which part?" He looked at her. She looked at him. The city spread out behind the window in its cold November geometry, all vertical lines and lit glass, and the room held its cedar warmth and its quiet, and she was aware of herself as someone who was fully, precisely, unambiguously in the room, not pressed against the wall, not below the sight line, not asking the space to absorb her invisible passage, but sitting in the chair at the desk with her name on the door, and her documentation on the screen, and her burgundy dress, and her body. She said, "Yes." He said, "Yes." It was not, she thought, a small word. It was not, from him, ever a small word. It was the word he used when something had been decided irrevocably, and the deciding was finished, and what remained was only the living of it. She turned back to her screen. He remained where he was. The city breathed below them in the cold, and the 42nd floor of Voss Holdings breathed its own particular warmth, and Lyra Okafor, certified forensic accountant, director of financial integrity, woman who took up the room she was in and had stopped apologizing for the size of the taking, put her hands on the keyboard and continued her work. If this story found you somewhere you needed to be found, hit the like button and let us know in the comments which moment broke through for you. Share this with someone who needs to hear that invisible is not the same as unseen. Subscribe to Cold Heart's Library for new stories every week, because we are always here when the night is long and you need to know someone gets it.